Alex Karp has often discussed the secular or lumpy nature of government revenue, and this has been one of the explanations for the recent slowing in government growth. With the widespread macro uncertainty, energy, Ukraine, Taiwan, and supply chains, to name a few, are you expecting the government revenue of the business to pick up, and if so, when do you think this will hit financials? This is a great question because we've been talking about the government business and some slowdowns that even caused, for example, ARK Invest to drop out of its holdings of Palantir for a couple quarters now. And we know the way the government business works for Palantir, it's weighted towards Q2 and Q3, those quarters specifically, and Palantir does not receive as much business due to the nature of the government contracts in the first quarter and the last quarter of the year. So that being said, back to the macro conflicts, Palantir in its Q1 conference call in May actually was able to discuss and speak to these concerns and, of course, the war between Russia and Ukraine. And what they said was during these troubling times across the world, and what they believe is their software is so impactful and so necessary that they are not going to stop deploying the software or put paperwork in front of the software, and rather they are going to make sure they're able to get going and deploy software ahead of any formal agreements, ahead of any contracts. And that's potentially why, because going back a few months now, we've had this opportunity for Palantir to really take hold and show its strength in times like these. But then, on the other hand, we saw Palantir give some relatively weak guidance for this second quarter, which we'll be getting results August 8th for that quarter. And we saw some weak guidance from my standpoint in terms of the revenue, and they basically said there could be upside, and they are just guiding for a base case, which wasn't really inspiring too much confidence. So back to the question here, I really think these sorts of benefits are going to hit the financials in a couple quarters to out a couple years, even if you want to look out that far. And the reason I think it's going to take that long is because you have to think about what Palantir does throughout an organization. And this works across government and across business as well. So Foundry and Gotham. The way they scale throughout an organization is not a fast process. It can be towards the scale phase. But first, when you're talking about acquiring and expanding, that takes a while because they have to set up the product. They have to make sure it's working well and completely customized for whatever needs there may be before they can really hit the latter half of that. And if you'll recall, the acquire phase does not generate a positive contribution margin. In fact, it's a negative contribution margin. So if we're talking about an impact on the financials, we're really looking for even past that expand phase, which is basically a zero contribution margin, and more towards that scale phase for the positive contribution margin, which in my opinion, we're looking at Q3 to see some impacts of that, and for them to guide for that on the Q2 call, as well as Q4 and into fiscal year 2023.